So we're going to have a quick panel discussion, and I'd like to invite the panelists, Greg Otto, Peter Zellner, Stefano Di Martino, and Professor Shu-Wei Guo to come up on stage. Real brief introductions. Greg Otto is partner and managing principal for Burrow-Happold Los Angeles. He's also an architect by training and practice, as well as an engineer. And he's faculty at the University of Southern California. Peter Zellner is faculty at SciArc, has actually been faculty here as well, has his own practice in Los Angeles. Stefano Di Martino is faculty, visiting professor here at the University of Southern California in landscape architecture, and Professor Shu-Wei Guo is the chair of architecture from Beijing University, Tsinghua Beijing University. I think I will start this off with a simple question. Are any of you ready to challenge the polemic that we are in the era or epoch of parametricism? Who's ready to stand up and challenge Professor Shu?
In fact, I agree with Patrick's explanation of architecture, modern architecture explanation in early 20th century. Now, we have already changed the concept of architecture itself. Today, nobody thinks the architecture, it's building itself. But we think the architecture is place. Place consists of three elements. One of them is the nature. Second, people's activity. And third, the building itself. But when we look at the nature and the people's activity, both of them are, I think, dynamic. The form of them are both irregular. The question is, why should building should building be regular form? Yeah, that's the questions. Building should be irregular, should be dynamic. How to get irregular building? We must depend on the parametric tools. Yeah, that's my opinion. Yeah, I cooperate near Lynch last 5 years in curating 3 exhibitions in Beijing. We call it ABB, yeah, Architecture Belonging in Beijing. The topic of the exhibition is digital design. After that, in these years, more and more young architects and students come to participate the explanation of parametricism, yeah, because it is useful. In fact, it's very useful to the new the architectural design. Yeah. And one issues we consider right now is how the final form to meet the people's requirements, and how to get how to get a friendly relationship with the nature. So the questions I would like to ask Patrick is, what's the start point of the design of your project? For my opinion, if we want to get a final form of architecture which is meet people's behavior and have a good relationship with the environment, we must consider of the start point of the design. That's to say, we should come back to the site, come back to the people's behavior. And also, we need a logic, process logic during design process, and keep this data in the beginning we investigated in the site or to the people. And then we get a result of the form which is meet the people's requirements. Yeah. So I think, yeah, there are come to 3 important issues in a parametric design process. One is the start point of the design. Second is the logic process, and then the final form, which the final irregular form must be could be fabricated, not to say the technology of the construction or fabrication. So what do you think of it?
What they mean, I mean, in the academic domain, I usually would start with systems, abstract systems, setting the topic from the side of, let's say, expanded notion of form. If I'm starting with the lead distinction of form and function in architecture, but form now is, you know, generated systems, processes. I would start with that, but most probably, I mean, usually, and we've done it many years. I would give a kind of very broad, programmatic, functional domain in which this might be settled. I should know if I'm talking about some kind of an urbanism, or whether I'm talking about a kind of the domain of I'm just aiming later on for a kind of pavilion or kind of structural, or I'm aiming for a kind of corporate environment or something. I'm giving a very, very broad direction, but I'm starting and let the project to develop its kind of internal, inherent logic of generative logic, let's say. I would start there. You can't quite do that in the real client project, let's say, where you, if you're talking about, in the end, delivering a high-performance architecture, you would have a lot of kind of potential systems repertoires in the back of your hand, and you would start thinking through and working up the program. You start with the functional heuristics, building up the brief, working up the brief, context, looking at, and then you kind of, you know, so these are radically different ways of starting. In the end, you aim for, and you, in both cases, you will aim for a kind of form, function, life process embedded and facilitated and sustained by a spatial arrangement. That's what you're aiming for in the final analysis. But you have to start with the form in the academic, you have to start with the functional analysis in the real project, which is where you have to really deliver. And there are projects in between, avant-garde manifesto projects, where you use the client, you use the project as a vehicle still for research. You might still tempted to treat it similar like an academic project, and kind of you wanted to do kind of single surface no matter what, and whatever comes along, you kind of force the single surface down its throat. You can do it because these things. I mean, I still, you know, and you can still get a semi-meaningful result, but it speaks to, it was more about realizing, constructing, projecting, still an experiment. And a lot of real projects are still manifesto experiments, although the client necessarily shouldn't know or doesn't know, or there's a kind of hybrid condition. So that's what you have to start with distinction, and then the real research, most probably, I mean, the research actually starts on two sides. The discipline is a little bit kind of split down that line. There's the formal researchers, new process, new media, new formal repertoires, and then those who like REM, who've been looking at social phenomena, just working up the kind of the problem domain. There's a solution domain, and there's a problem domain, and both need to be worked up. And usually, there's a little coincidence. So there's those who work this one up, and there's those who work up this. Unfortunately, there's a kind of a little bit of a conflict and blindness. And Peter once had a great conference where we tried to bring these two worlds together. Yeah. And I think they're still too much apart. But you can't solve everything in one go. So I do cherish and recognize the need for formal research, And I've been privileging the academic, but you read and learn and try to know that the aim that formal research is in principle following the right direction. Anyway, that's where I would say. But in the end, you have to load up the problems onto and you burden sequentially, slowly, the formal agendas and systems with problems, but don't overburden them too quickly, because that means they're just failed and dusted. But you also have to kind of allow the problem formulation to be aware of the solution spaces. So you have problems searching for solution, but you have also solutions going in to search for problems, because the problem domain is very large. That's why I don't want to even predetermine a kind of formal proliferating experimental project should be quite open to where it finds in the end its kind of domain of application. Anyway, that's where I would say.
So Stefano, maybe you could go next.
Well, given that a lot of the domain of application of your projects, your realized projects, seems to be retail, shopping, commercial, office space, could you say how do these aspects reveal themselves to be avant-garde, radical, and in any way research-based?
I mean, the key point here is that the cultural, in the end, the claim is that all aspects of life in this civilization can be treated with these principles, right? And the bigger the project, the more necessary is to work on these means. I think the competitive edge of pragmatism will become clearest in urbanism, also very clear and dominant in large complex projects. When it comes to a mobile phone, minimalism can still cut it, and maybe with a small house, a gallery space or something, right? So there's this, so there's a universal, but where, and the relationship between avant-garde and mainstream is all about winning the avant-garde discourse and then moving mainstream. And I'm sometimes asked, aren't you sad, and do you think isn't it awful that KPF and SOM are now kind of jumping on the parametrics bandwagon? No, that's great. You know, the projects they're doing are not parametricists, but aspects of this. They help investing in these new technologies, new paradigm. They bring forward the new paradigm. They're contributing, and even the most awful commercial project, you can see that they're kind of learned something. They're more versatile. You can see the new way of handling compositional kind of situations. I'm satisfied that this kind of thing spills and transforms into the mainstream, and we want to bring our work, and we becoming, to a certain extent, mainstream to the extent that this style is becoming mainstream, and therefore, and I think the shopping, a kind of commercial shopping complex, it is high performance in the sense that we're having this kind of multi-level simultaneity, participation. There's a kind of navigability of the space, the kind of non-corner flow where you draw and pull and distribute people. There's a number of things, a lot of connections, a lot of layered space. Wherever you are, you see many things going on. So this works for a kind of live-work, kind of urban office retail complex as a contemporary expression of contemporary life, better than that could be kind of delivered in a kind of modernist box or kind of neoclassical structure. So it is as avant-garde as it has to be. It has to win out and take over from what's been going on so far, and
the question
it's
is
not
really
a kind of revolution of society.
But the question is really whether your ambition is that to the engagement of these new techniques, in fact not so new techniques, whether there would be a change in the way these events happen. In other words, commerce or shopping or any of those things, or the production of culture and so on, are any of those things going to change because of these new plans? Or are you actually just fossilizing all these things and reinforcing the existing structures without giving us any hope whatsoever of any change ever?
No, I think that what I feel is that of course you cannot substitute architecture for kind of social progress and transformations, but architecture is facilitating, is necessary, and congenial to the most this architecture is congenial to the most progressive tendencies of contemporary society, which is as a totality very, very contradictory. But for instance, when we looked at the corporate fields agenda in terms of looking at the most advanced, highly competing corporations, Microsoft, Google, they have a kind of internal revolution of their own corporate culture, their process of communication, their spaces of work. And we try to be congenial with that. The progressive elements, which are about self-organization with the participatory structures, flat hierarchies, mobile, multiple team connectivities. That's what we're trying to affiliate with, and we're trying to create a kind of three-dimensional, deep, differentiated, continuous bureau landschaft, which I think makes sense for that. So you can go through cultural institutions where I think this idea of simultaneity, a kind of a cultural institution where you have conferencing, library, museum, they open a kind of the way we treat a kind of lecture hall, we wouldn't seal it off. You would open it up. You would allow a kind of sense of quick orientation and multiple participation and simultaneous event. That's what this kind of architecture delivers. Instead of a modernist where you go into a little lobby, you disappear into a corridor and elevator, and you don't know what else is going on in the building. You would and how to do that. So it's about the intensification of relations, as I said. Our lives become kind of multitasking, multiple. We have to garner and distribute more information. We have to reinvent ourselves very, very quickly to remain productive. And that's what this architecture is congenial to, because it allows you to cope, organize, and articulate more simultaneous relations, more relatedness of everything to everything else, so you can navigate and participate in many more kind of platforms and modes, moments of communication than you could being hidden away in an office cell in a kind of silo slab, separated off. That is kind of the kiss of death. That's why these was no longer productive. There was a kind of haphazard re-inhabitation of a historic center, maladapted as it is, was better than these kind of kiss of death silos. And what we're doing now is we're creating the kind of spaces as platforms of communication, and said architecture is about the societal function of architecture is the framing, spatial framing of communication, of social communication. That's what we where we are aligned with the progressive tendencies of contemporary world society. That would be my answer.
Peter. Okay, well, Patrick, it's lovely to see you in Los Angeles. I came here and I just had an epiphany, which is that I'm on the losing team. Because we're still doing white boxes, so of course I want to sign up. But before I do, I want to time out. A beautiful presentation. I think it's the will to power, the muscle that your office shows now. It's what all architects really dream about. But to a certain extent, I'm curious about the lack of doubt, and I understand that the rhetoric is necessary, but progress is a kind of it produces both invention and innovation, but it also produces tragedy, and so. I don't have a response to the work. I mean, I think it's remarkable, but I'm reminded of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, blown forward into the future and basically looking back. This is the Paul Klee, looking back at the catastrophe of progress, modernization. And Korb also talked about the beauty of the accident. He called New York 100 times a catastrophe, but then 50 times a beautiful catastrophe. So I just wonder, I know that you don't believe that there's any value in critique now, that we must be progressive and positivist about this, but I wonder if these tools don't also now give us the ability to deal with the accidental, not just the kind of the visionary. And that's the only way I can get into this conversation, because I think that otherwise it's absolutely complete, and I think we should go home. But can there be a critique? Could Tafuri do anything with this work?
Well, no, of course. I mean, just to pick you up on the, I mean, the period of doubt was, of course, there. It was a kind of decade of you know, deep criticism, you know, which participating in the total intellectual paradigm shift, you know, de-essentializing our categories, the whole ripping through of post-structuralist insight, the linguistic turn, kind of Deleuze and all his kind of fertile repertoire of concept, bringing in to understand this new science. That there was, of course, a lot of working through, a lot of kind of criticism, a lot of experiments, and I think, of course, every new generation of students have to kind of should ideally also understand that, learn the kind of how to defend and understand and see how that this kind of work emerged from a competitive struggle of ideas and theories and with one out and lives up to the challenges of this kind of period of, let's say, philosophical critique and searching, which I've been part of. And I mean, I was a student in the early 80s. I was kind of entered a school where there was still hardcore modernism. Then the first kind of figure in the graphics department kind of brought in postmodernism. We read kind of Venturi and so on, and then you moved. Then deconstructivism came on board. Then kind of that was challenged and ripped apart in the early 90s under the label of folding. There was kind of in a short kind of architectural career, there were always kind of 3 or 4 compressed time shifts of living through and reliving, like the kind of embryonic living through the evolution. Every student has to kind of recuperate that position where we're at, but that doesn't mean that we keep going through the same battles. And I don't see a kind of another new challenge on the horizon. I mean, we've discussed it through, and I've been the one. I mean, we had the seminars and the discussions, and somehow you work through that, and then you move on. Of course, we can still enter a debate. And I think one point.
Maybe here's my point. It's interesting because, and maybe the irony here is that our positions are reversed. Because as an American in the 21st century, I'm filled with doubt. And perhaps a European looks at the world now in a very different way. But we've switched positions because this was the culture of the architecture of Albert Kahn, you know, the production line for the Model T Ford. And Europe was the culture of critique for a long time. And so it's interesting to me now that, you know, I'm the doubter, perhaps, and maybe it has more to do with the position of the architect in this culture today.
But do you think, for instance, Corbusier should be kind of doubt-ridden in 1920?
No, but I think
I mean,
at the end of his life
I think it's so ahistorical to say to in the 70s suddenly say modernism was a mistake.
Right.
You know, that's totally ahistorical. Even to say, you know, communism collapsed, but communism was also not a mistake. It was a logical conclusion of the Fordist paradigm of production. All of Europe and America was becoming planned, semi-planned economies. It was a success story, and this civilization, it wasn't a catastrophe of modernization. What modernization delivered is amazing. That in a country like Germany, perhaps not, of course, not globally yet, but in Germany, every worker, every member of society had a higher level of material plenty, well-being, security, and conquering of the vicissitudes of this universe than Louis XIV.
Sure.
Absolutely. He had switched on the light, had a phone, watched TV, what's happening on the globe, go to the toilet, medical, pampering, fridge, washing machine. Louis XIV's life was claptrap shit compared to
Right.
every single being in the 60 million population. And that was delivered by modernism. And
sure.
so
Absolutely.
where's the doubt?
Well,
What you choose?
that's not what I'm arguing for. I think that in Korb's work, there's also the artistic possibility of understanding that the recognition of both the tragedy of architecture and its potential strengthens the work. So, late Korb, I think, would have a very different relationship to technologies of mechanization than early Korb. And post-war Korb would also have a very different position about expression, as an artistic endeavor versus the expression of the zeitgeist of an era. So, and I guess maybe the question would be then ultimately, there was a slide you had about this being an expression of a sort of new social order. What I'd like to know then is what is that order? Because if anything, it's become more disaggregated, at least in our culture, more miniaturized, and more kind of, I think, about the individual rather than the collective. At the level of this and social networking sites, and I mean, there's more and more of everything, but there's less and less of a kind of collective space.
I think much more, the absolute opposite. I mean, the intensification of communication is happening on all levels. We all fly more. I mean, we meet more, we fly more, we mobile communicate more, we Twitter, we blog, we Facebook, we have. I mean, I think the amount of communication which we able to engender and do. I mean, and through the internet, but also through physical presence and better spaces which facilitate integration, communication. The intensification of relatedness is so exponential. We need all levels. That's why I don't believe that the media crowd out architecture. I don't believe that. I think we need, in particular, we know it in our firm. We are kind of 300 people. We need to work on our space. We need to reorganize and reorganize. We create mechanisms, platforms of communication, of coming together, lectures, and, social events. We had the office party. We flew 300 people to Rome, and we had the museum from midnight to 6 in the morning. And you need that space. It was fantastic. I mean, I don't think, but it's required to this. It's a task. To get 300 people working in one direction and wanting to communicate, and we had late night discussions in the museum with. I mean, that's, I think, what you need and what is happening. I wouldn't be kind of pessimistic. Maybe I pick another point up. I think it was interesting where you said the unpredictable, and there was a lot of kind of interest in the emergent and the unpredictable, not knowing where it's going. And so the accident. I mean, there is some truth in this that with an alertness, I mean, these are mechanisms of invention. With an alertness, you let a lot of see, and you have to kind of, then the fitness criteria to draw it out, but also in real social processes, you have a kind of sense of self-organization in a corporation, the way you utilize spaces. I love that whole discourse, the virtual house, if you remember that, and the kind of, and the ability of appropriating, settling into richly differentiated but abstract, not predetermined environments, and a kind of near like aleatoric process of appropriating, like Da Vinci takes the kind of water patches pattern on the wall and creates a landscape out of it. To a certain extent, that is also happening. I'm trying to integrate that, a kind of specificity to this dialectic of specificity and openness of course, if you offer a kind of neutral, flat surface in a gigantic hall, no self-organization, no kind of, nothing will happen. You can't leave it kind of unstructured and help them. On the other hand, you cannot kind of prescribe everything and think it all through. And this will also not happen. Between these extremes, there's a kind of interesting dialectic and that's a kind of infinite project to kind of get this right, to calibrate that. But that's why also I'm trying. If I have my doubts, is about the role, because I'm confronting this in DRL every single semester. I haven't managed to find the role of agent-based modeling into that paradigm, its function, where it places, what its contribution is, where its failing is, and because I'm not on that side. So that's what kept me thinking here that
you said agent, not Asian.
Multi agent.
All right, Peter. I'm gonna try one more time, and then I'm gonna give up. because I feel like the
That's
cartoon
there's a
character who keeps hitting the wall and kind of sliding off. Do you think, and this is, I just want to pick up on this, do you think that architectural structures should parallel social structures, or as you're sort of indicating, there might be the opportunity for some form of subversion? And I'm thinking that Hausmann could have never anticipated De Boer. Where is there any room for the user to kind of quote unquote hack your system? Or is it closed?
Yeah. No, I think there is this, as I said earlier, there's a functional heuristics which doesn't go with the kind of highly typologized, premeditated, prescriptive allocation of programs, sorting it into kind of structure. That is true. There is a kind of more kind of dialectical process between program formation and spatial framing of that. So I would say, and there is, I mean, this kind of moment of subversion, it was quite prevalent in the deconstructivist debate about kind of disrupting the institution, dislocating. It made sense because we had actually to deconstruct modernist institutions, modernist spaces, and there was this kind of moment of disruption, and becomes a kind of there's a kind of political edge to it, but you can't generalize it as an architectural kind of project, because once you've deconstructed,
you've rebuilt.
Where you're going, and so that moment, yes, it's a kind of creative moment of cajoling, of offering, of creating potentials, and of course working with expectation, and you discuss and fight it out with the clients. But I'm not somebody who thinks that, I mean, architecture can substitute for politics, nor for a client. And if you confront the client, particularly democratically constituted client, with legitimate representatives of the organization, institution you're designing for, it's a little bit kind of you quite quickly self-control and give up these pretensions. And who are you to kind of think that you second guess and substitute yourselves for in front of a kind of institutional representative? And I think that's a kind of vanity and falsity in a kind of overly politically critically discourse in architecture, and tell somebody, Reinhold, go out and become a politician, and that's the domain. You're working in the wrong communication system. You know, it doesn't make sense. So we'll be very cautious. Although as I say, work with the progressive tendencies you find, but trust that the others have kind of formulated their desires and agendas and hopes and requirements, and be congenial to that. Don't substitute your kind of out of your ignorance yourself for it. I think that's a kind of meaningless posture.
So Patrick, as a way to segue from hacking the system to Greg, the question that I sort of have is around one of the tenets of the theory of parametricism, which is correlation. And maybe you could describe a little bit more how you see engineering and the design teams operating in a correlative fashion, as well as maybe saying where ultimately the system can be hacked by the end users in that.
And I'll just add to that, because it's a very much related question. I'm intrigued with all of the proposals and all of the work that was presented today, and essentially, you know, the scripting, the analysis, the simulations. And I'm always very interested, not so much in the script behind it or the piece of software producing it, but I'm actually interested in the individual or the individuals partaking and where they stop, where they make it stop, and what is that criteria, what is that evaluation, and how does that participation then shape, and what is the value system that is governing those decisions?
Well, one of the key problems I'm grappling with, and I formed a position on, is the role of engineering optimization and the expressing the physical logic. I mean, first, within a building, and let's say tectonic articulation, what it should be about and what it transport. And first of all, what we have to reject, I think, is that the kind of making transparent articulation, which all buildings are doing, they kind of speak to us, we orient, we understand them. It should never be about the physical construct as such. So I reject kind of structural expressionism or the kind of the revealing the construct itself. And how it's made to kind of, that's to show that out would be kind of a waste of time. This interests architect as expert, but it doesn't interest the audience who has to live in these buildings. So, but at the same time, of course, you have to, I'm interested in structural optimization, I'm interested in environmental adaptation, because our existence is a physical existence as well as a communication existence. And the way it has to be, so it's in a strange kind of usurpation or free riding on what has to be there anyway, a kind of, let's say, the major structural system in a building will always be there, will always have to be grappled with, and you have to kind of forge a kind of symbiosis between the kind of structural logic and the functional phenomenology of the building. And you use that primary structure and you hook onto it kind of articulate notions. You align circulation with primary structural lines so that the beam becomes a guiding as well as a structural. The differentiation of the beam and its kind of momentum depth is also indicates the center of a space. So, but for the audience and for you as an architect, it's about indicating the center of the space. It's not didactics of structural performance. So that's the kind of, you cannot deny for these physical sides. You cannot kind of deny it away. It will come back to haunt you and will rip through your beautiful design with a vengeance. So you have to kind of serve that force and turn it to advantage and forge a kind of unexpected and inherently artificial alliance between your articulation agenda, which is all about articulating the social distinctions, processes, orienting with these systems. And the same, let's say, if you talk about adapting to the envelope to kind of environmental performance, yes, it should perform because you can't, it's absurd to overheat the building, to kind of pump air, to build huge mechanical systems which eat away space. But what I love is that you can have that coincidence, this kind of strange coincidence of capacities, that the beautifully adapted, well-adapted envelope becomes also an orienting, accentuating layer, because now you look at the building, you see which direction, where's south, as you know, you can remember there's a certain asymmetrization according to orientation, so, and of the building relative to context, so you can utilize this. So I'm looking for these kind of utilization, forging, symbiotic, I make all these engineering automation vehicles of an articulatory project. But I'm also allowing myself then to go beyond that, and that's what I said earlier, it's not the Frei Otto discourse of the optimized, self-organized matter into a structure which would just be a physical structure of holding up, but it becomes, I'm interested to use these artificial correlative kind of radiating networking of elements it's basically a semiotic or perceptual semiotic project that has been crowded out because there was a so-called shift from representation to performance and performativity. But I think what has been temporarily healthy, but we got to bring back kind of the semiotic project, but it's more of a perceptual project of orienting and the emphasis of articulation, because buildings function in the end, perform through people who understand where they are drawn into certain places. There's a coding of framing of a social institution. When we sit down, that we need to know where we're sitting, what we're supposed to do. There's a kind of environment which kind of reduces a so-called double contingency. When people meet, they don't know what they're doing. They need to kind of frame a social institution. All these things are mattering, and I think, of course, we're not reading buildings like kind of semiotic text. It's more in a state of distraction and quick orientation, kind of more visceral, like neural network style, let's say. But But that's the real, true kind of domain of architecture, which is a different expertise from engineering. For us, it's all about how things function through being perceived, understood, comprehended, and more like this. If you look at the modernist period, it's literally more the physical operation of separating this group from this group, sound separation and locking them away from each other, more like a prison or like a cage. Contemporary social institutions are much more open. The thresholds are not literally built walls. They're kind of nuances that you have to read and navigate. And because there's an intensification of relations, you still have to structure and put people in their place and orient them. So there's much more, it works much more through articulation than through organization. I make this distinction. You physically organize. That's what engineering also helps you to do. And then you articulate and how things look like, the similarities, association, reminiscences, that if you come from this side, it evolves differently from the other side. All this kind of, as I said, how you decompose the scene, all these things is the domain of architecture. It is very, very visual. Appearances matter enormously. That's what we're the expert in choreographing and orchestrating. So these intensities and relatedness on the level of appearances. I'm just saying, if you don't see it, as an architect, you're not interested in the orders. Invisible orders are not interesting.
This ties actually to the front row and maybe one of the last questions. But you said you've laid out parametricism and you describe all of the techniques that are included. And you've also just said that one of the things that you're not siding with yet is multi-agent systems, or to quote Manuel, collection of consequences of unintended actions from the first discussion. And I would say that I bet within the research group at the office, eventually they're going to put something in front of you which will change your mind. I think that will come for you. But I would also suggest that you're not quite fluent with it or familiar or comfortable, because in some ways there's this issue of directed authorship and being able to sort of trust it to give the singularities or the types of forms that you're renowned for producing with the teams. And actually, I would almost pass it to the front row before you start to answer, but go ahead.
No, I think it's interesting. Sorry, but the important, for me, what I find interesting about the multi-agent systems, and I've been working with students on this, let's say you can kind of create an information processing, an intelligence which might be acquired, which is beyond intuition, which is beyond kind of thinking it through in terms of classification and syllogisms and so on. And that intelligence is what I'm interested in, and you can harness this, but it's not what is topical here. But the problem is I often have, as an architect, I'm not interested in if that intelligence, that would be in the domain of engineering nearly, let's say, organization. If you can't see it, I'm not interested in it. And my problem often is with the agent-based projects, they remain amorphous. You cannot detect the differences that supposedly the intelligence have worked through, but you cannot perceive. And that's where I see the limitations. If that becomes phenomenologically pertinent and self-revealing, I'm flying towards that, let's say. And I'm interested, of course, in the intelligence. I mean, let's say, look at space syntax and these kind of techniques, and where, on the one hand, these analytic techniques, but also they're using also agent-based modeling to create interesting organizational patterns. I'm interested in it on the level of organization. It could, in the end, be specialized as an engineering input. And I'm still waiting for the kind of aesthetic valency or powers of this, and I'm rejecting kind of the fetishization of the generative and emergent. I mean, at the stage in the design process, yes, but not as a kind of end game, because you can't bring it back. And where I am with having to create high-performance projects.
Ben, I think, Ben, you're going to have to be the last question.
Okay, I'll try to make it a good one then. So my question then begins with the link between what Lev had said a bit earlier about that parametric that the parametric is in many ways definitional of the condition in which we find ourselves. In a way, it is the global condition. And your claims for a parametricism as a general platform. And the question I really have, but let me ask it in a sort of roundabout way, is why, if that is the case, it comes to us to produce, in many cases, more homogeneity than heterogeneity. In fact, we're reducing species. We're not adding more species. Now, the question was lead to this differentiation between to organize versus articulating social complexity in the post-Fordist society. And I assume that the claim for scalar authority over all artifacts has more to do with the second in terms of the articulating than it has to do with the organizing. These are obviously very different things, to organize and to articulate with that level of authority. So part of it has to do with should we read the work more as and I think this is where Peter was getting at, as an image or an index of that network condition, or as something that actually is attempting to intervene and organize in it, and exactly what are the economies and consequences of this, which are of course really different. Now, earlier there's a couple people were talking about if we were going to do this conference again in 10 years, so forth and so on. Well, first thing I think, if we're going to do this conference again in 10 years, first and foremost, we shouldn't be all architects, right? The question of parametricism is something that already is at work in economics departments, political science departments, biology departments, as Marcos will remind us, network theory, so forth and so on. And to me, it would be to answer this question of the organization versus articulation and where architecture wants to sit within this. It would have to do so within those other employments of parametricism and where the boundaries sort of sit. Now, it seems to me that the master theory of which you're sort of working with is, of course, not deconstruction, I think, but is really systems theory, or particularly Luhmann's and communications systems theory. Is that correct in this? Okay. Now, the problem for Luhmann and any of these sorts of things has to do with really the boundary of the system. And how do you define the boundary of the system within this as well? So, with that in mind, the question I would ask to you is not just what is the position of architecture in relation to the other disciplines that are based on parametricism, in that as well, but which one and how would you locate this in terms of their capacity to model each other? Right? Architecture becoming a model for these other modes of parametrics, or these other things becoming models for the architectural within this way. So that's the.
It's very interesting. I mean, yes, it's quite curious that you detected my overarching framework, which I haven't touched and won't touch too much on it now, is social system theory. As a kind of framework in which I want to theorize architecture as an autopoietic system of communication, which in fact I would argue is one of the great function systems, in Luhmann's term, of world society, and there's the world architecture. I think that there is, of course, inspirational currents which migrate across disciplines, the different disciplines of the sciences, but also between a function system like science and function system like design/architecture. I agree with that, but I don't think that there is a direct. I wouldn't be sure that a conference should be a kind of mixed conference. There's definitely a need for also a conference of architecture as a kind of self-referentially closed system of communications, which is aware, of course, of environmental demands, constraints, and draws on inspirations. But I don't think that, I think there is sui generis concerns and aspects and tasks and frameworks of conceptualization and architecture which are incommensurable with system of sciences, system of politics, system of economics. These are incremental, separate domains of societal communication, and how they relate to each other is through. So I'm not sure if I would expect the concept of parametrism to migrate and be relevant to these domains. Yeah.
Just rephrase it
Yeah.
one in a simple
Yeah.
yes/no question.
Yeah.
Are there architectural practices, potential or real, that would take far more promiscuous relationships with these other disciplines or modes of thinking that you would find to be equally as legitimately parametricist as your own?
No.
Actually, on that note, I'd like to thank Patrick Schumacher and the panel. 15 minutes.